I beat the elderly in the column to show strength, and now I'm afraid to look in the mirror. This is my last letter. Mother, I write these words as my final confession because I can no longer live with what I became, what I chose to become, what I allowed myself to enjoy. The mirror shows me a stranger wearing my face, laughing with my voice, using my hands to cause pain for no reason except to prove I could. The old man's eyes still look at me from the reflection, asking why, always asking why, and I have no answer except that it felt good to be feared, to be powerful, to make others smaller so I could feel larger. Don't let these voices disappear. Subscribe now so these words can reach others. The letter was discovered in 1987, hidden inside a hollowed-out prayer book found in the estate of Sergeant Major Wilhelm Krauss, late of the 4th SS Police Division. Krauss had died alone in a Munich apartment, surrounded by 40 years of silence and empty bottles that could not wash away the taste of what he had done during the war. His landlord, clearing the apartment for new tenants, almost threw away the prayer book before noticing its unusual weight and discovering the confession sealed inside its gutted pages. Wilhelm Heinrich Krauss was born September 3, 1921, in the village of Rostock, on the Baltic coast where fishing boats returned each evening with silver nets full of herring, and the lighthouse keeper's daughter sang sailors home through fog that rolled in like ghostly fingers reaching across the water. His father, Heinrich, had been a dock worker before the war, a man whose calloused hands could splice rope with the precision of a surgeon, and whose weather-beaten face could read storms 3 days before they arrived. His mother, Greta, baked bread for the village and taught Sunday school to children who fidgeted through Bible stories about mercy, forgiveness, and the sacred duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. Wilhelm was the second of 5 children, the boy who helped his father repair nets and his mother knead dough that would feed neighbors too poor to buy bread from the commercial bakery in town. His hands were strong from childhood labor but gentle with small creatures. He could nurse injured seabirds back to health, untangle fishing line without breaking it, help younger siblings with their letters while storms rattled windows and candles flickered against the Baltic wind. I beat the elderly, Wilhelm wrote in handwriting that grew more erratic as his confession progressed. Not because they threatened me or resisted orders or posed any danger to German security. I beat them because I could, because beating them made other prisoners fear me, because fear gave me power and power felt better than anything I had ever experienced. The transformation began in 1940, when Wilhelm was conscripted into the Waffen-SS at age 19. He trained at Dachau, learned to march in perfect formation, shoot with deadly accuracy, follow orders without question or conscience. The instructors emphasized absolute obedience, racial superiority, the sacred duty to eliminate weakness wherever it appeared. Mercy was bourgeois sentimentality. Compassion was racial betrayal. Strength was the only virtue that mattered in the new Germany that would rule Europe for 1,000 years. Wilhelm excelled at military training not because he believed in Nazi ideology but because structure felt safer than chaos, because belonging to something larger than himself provided meaning that his village life had never offered, because being part of an elite unit made him feel important for the first time in his life. To show strength, Wilhelm continued, returning again and again to the phrase that had justified everything, that had transformed cruelty into duty and sadism into patriotic service. That's what Hauptsturmführer told us. Show strength so they know we're serious. Show strength so they respect German authority. Show strength so word spreads and others submit without resistance. Wilhelm's unit was assigned to anti-partisan operations in occupied Poland, tasked with maintaining order among civilian populations that might support resistance activities. Their methods were deliberately brutal, designed not just to eliminate specific threats but to terrorize entire communities into absolute submission. Fear was their most effective weapon, and fear required visible demonstrations of what happened to those who dared to challenge German authority. The prisoners arrived in columns that stretched for kilometers, thousands of Polish civilians being relocated from villages that had been designated for German settlement. They walked at gunpoint, carrying whatever possessions they could manage, moving toward destinations they were not permitted to know. The elderly moved slowly, struggling under the weight of bundles that contained everything they owned, frequently falling behind the pace that younger prisoners could maintain. Wilhelm's job was to keep the columns moving, to ensure that no one delayed the march through weakness, exhaustion, or deliberate resistance. He carried a rubber truncheon and iron rod, weapons designed to inflict pain without causing immediate death, tools that could motivate compliance without reducing the labor force that Germany needed for war production. "We laughed," Wilhelm confessed, describing the sound that would echo in his memory for 47 years after the war ended. "When they stumbled and fell, when they begged for water, when they cried out in Polish words we didn't understand but whose meaning was always the same. Please, mercy, help, stop. We laughed because laughter made it feel like a game instead of what it really was." But what Wilhelm could not write, even in his final confession, was the deepest truth about those marches through the Polish countryside. That he had enjoyed the work, had looked forward to each day's assignment, had felt genuinely disappointed when transfers or leave interrupted his opportunities to exercise absolute power over people who could not fight back. The enjoyment was not ideological. Wilhelm cared nothing about racial theory or German supremacy or the 1,000-year Reich that Hitler promised. His pleasure was simpler and more personal. The intoxication of complete control over other human beings, the rush of fear in their eyes when he approached, the knowledge that his whims could determine whether they experienced pain or relief. The specific incident that haunted Wilhelm's final years occurred on October 15, 1943, during a forced march from the village of Krasnik to a labor camp 30 kilometers away. The column included approximately 800 civilians, mostly elderly residents and families with small children who had been deemed unsuitable for immediate deportation to extermination camps, but useful for agricultural labor that would support the German war effort. Among the prisoners was a man Wilhelm would never forget. Jakob Rosenberg, 73 years old, a retired teacher who had spent 40 years educating village children and who walked with a limp from a childhood injury that had never properly healed. Jakob carried a small suitcase containing his most precious possessions. Photographs of students who had learned to read in his classroom, letters from former pupils who had written to thank him for changing their lives, a wedding ring that had belonged to his wife who had died the previous winter. "They begged," Wilhelm wrote, describing the sound that had followed him across 4 decades of trying to forget. "Not for freedom or mercy or justice, just for permission to rest, to drink water, to sit down for 5 minutes while their hearts stopped racing and their legs remembered how to support their weight." Such small requests, such tiny expressions of human need. And we denied them all. Jakob Rosenberg fell for the 3rd time at kilometer marker 7. His elderly legs simply giving out under the weight of exhaustion, dehydration, and the terror that comes from knowing you are completely at the mercy of people who have no mercy to offer. He lay in the dirt road, breathing heavily, trying to gather strength for another attempt to stand and continue walking. Wilhelm approached the fallen man with his truncheon ready, prepared to deliver the beating that would motivate Jakob to resume walking or serve as an example to other prisoners who might be considering similar displays of weakness. Standard procedure was to strike the legs and back, avoiding the head to prevent unconsciousness that would make continued walking impossible. But when Wilhelm looked down at Jakob Rosenberg, something shifted in his perception. Instead of seeing a security threat or labor resource, he saw an opportunity to demonstrate his power in front of 800 witnesses who would remember this moment and share the story with others who might consider resistance. The beating was no longer about maintaining march discipline, it was about theater. "I see their eyes at night," Wilhelm confessed, describing the haunting that had made sleep impossible for decades. Not just his eyes, but the eyes of everyone who watched. Prisoners who learned that pleading would bring more pain, not less. Guards who learned that I enjoyed the work more than duty required. My own eyes, reflected in puddles and windows and mirrors, growing stranger each day. Wilhelm beat Jakob Rosenberg for 17 minutes, far longer than military efficiency required, long enough for the entertainment value to become obvious to everyone present. He struck the old man's legs until walking became impossible, then his back until breathing became difficult, then his hands until holding his suitcase became torture that continued for the remaining 23 kilometers of the march. The beating was punctuated by laughter. Wilhelm's laughter, echoed by other guards who understood that this was performance as much as punishment, that their colleague was demonstrating the kind of creativity that might earn recognition from superior officers who valued initiative in developing new methods of psychological control. My laughter returned to me, Wilhelm wrote in the most devastating line of his confession. 40 years later, I still hear it. Not from memory but from the mirror. From the stranger wearing my face who laughs at old men falling down. Who finds entertainment in suffering. Who discovered that causing pain was more intoxicating than any drug the world had ever produced. Jakob Rosenberg died during the night following the march. His body giving out after hours of walking on legs that had been systematically damaged for the amusement of guards who had forgotten that entertainment should not require human suffering. His death was recorded in camp logs as natural causes exhaustion, with no mention of the beating that had made his exhaustion fatal. Wilhelm learned of the death the following morning and felt no guilt, no remorse, no recognition that he had murdered an elderly teacher whose only crime had been the weakness that comes with age. Instead, he felt satisfaction that his methods had been effective, that his reputation for brutality would spread among prisoners and guards alike, that he had established himself as someone whose displeasure carried lethal consequences. The psychological aftermath began months later, when Wilhelm was transferred to garrison duty in Germany and found himself with time to think about what he had done during his service in Poland. Without the constant pressure of active operations, without the group dynamics that had normalized cruelty, without the ideology that had justified every action, Wilhelm began to remember Jakob Rosenberg not as a security threat but as a human being who had died for entertainment. If the story moved you, support this work so the truth continues to reach people. The mirror in Wilhelm's barracks became his enemy, reflecting a face he no longer recognized, showing him eyes that had watched an old man die and found the experience amusing. He began avoiding reflective surfaces, shaving by touch, keeping his gaze fixed on the ground when walking past windows that might show him his own reflection. But mirrors were everywhere in a world designed by people who had never learned to fear their own faces. Shop windows, puddles, the polished surfaces of military equipment, every reflection showed Wilhelm the stranger who had taken over his body, who used his voice to laugh at suffering, who had discovered that power could be more addictive than love, more satisfying than mercy, more rewarding than the simple human connections that had once made life meaningful. Wilhelm tried to rebuild his sense of self after the war ended, returning to Rostock where his family welcomed their surviving son with tears of joy and relief. He worked on fishing boats, helped his father repair nets, attempted to find purpose in the simple labor that had defined his childhood. But every task reminded him of the hands that had wielded truncheons. Every conversation echoed with laughter that had accompanied an old man's death. The nightmares began in 1947 and continued for the rest of Wilhelm's life. Not dreams about combat or military action, but dreams about mirrors that showed him beating Jakob Rosenberg while his own laughter provided soundtrack to 17 minutes of systematic torture. He would wake screaming, not from fear but from the recognition that the laughter in his dreams was not memory but present reality. He was still laughing, still enjoying the memory, still intoxicated by the power he had exercised over someone who could not fight back. Wilhelm left Rostock in 1952, unable to bear his family's love for someone they did not really know, unable to pretend that he deserved the affection of people who would have been horrified by the truth about their beloved son. He moved to Munich, took a job in a factory that required no interaction with other workers, rented an apartment where he could live alone with memories that made companionship impossible. For 35 years, Wilhelm existed rather than lived, working mechanically, drinking systematically, avoiding every situation that might require him to look at his own reflection or make decisions that could affect other people's well-being. He spoke to no one about his wartime service, maintained no friendships, pursued no romantic relationships, eliminated every opportunity for human connection that might require him to pretend he was still the person his family remembered. Now I'm afraid to look in the mirror, Wilhelm wrote in the confession that consumed his final weeks. Not because I don't recognize the face looking back at me, but because I recognize it perfectly. It's the face of someone who learned that causing pain could be pleasurable, that having power over others was more satisfying than using power to help them. It's the face of someone who laughed while an old man died and felt proud of the laughter. Wilhelm began writing his confession on his 66th birthday, September 3, 1987, exactly 44 years after beating Jakob Rosenberg to death for the entertainment of 800 prisoners who had learned that pleading for mercy would only increase their suffering. The writing consumed every hour not devoted to work or the minimal maintenance required to keep his body functioning. The confession spans 47 pages of careful handwriting, each word formed with the precision of someone who understood that this would be his only opportunity to tell the truth about what he had done, what he had enjoyed, what he had become during his service with the SS. Wilhelm wrote without attempting to justify his actions, without claiming that circumstances had made cruelty necessary, without asking for forgiveness that he knew he did not deserve. "This is my last letter," Wilhelm concluded, acknowledging that some confessions can only be made by people who have already decided that living with their memories has become impossible. "I write it not for absolution but for testimony. Someone must know that Jakob Rosenberg existed, that he was a teacher who spent his life helping children learn to read, that he died because I found his suffering entertaining rather than horrifying." Wilhelm sealed his confession in the prayer book that had belonged to his mother, the same book from which she had taught him about mercy, forgiveness, and the sacred duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. He placed the book on his kitchen table, arranged his financial documents to ensure his landlord would be compensated for any damages, and consumed an entire bottle of sleeping pills while sitting in the one chair in his apartment that faced away from any reflective surface. Wilhelm Krauss died on October 15, 1987, exactly 44 years after killing Jakob Rosenberg, his body discovered 3 days later by neighbors who had noticed the smell of death seeping through apartment walls. The official report listed his death as suicide by drug overdose, with no mention of the confession that had driven him to choose death over continued living with unbearable memories. The prayer book containing Wilhelm's confession was discovered by his landlord, Herr Müller, who initially planned to discard all personal effects left by a tenant who had died without family, friends, or anyone who might want to preserve his memory. But the book's unusual weight prompted closer examination, revealing the confession that had been hidden inside pages that once contained stories about redemption, mercy, and the possibility that even the worst sinners could find peace through acknowledgement of their crimes. Müller read Wilhelm's confession by candlelight, understanding immediately that he held evidence of war crimes that had never been prosecuted, testimony about systematic brutality that historians had documented but rarely in such personal detail. Müller faced the choice between destroying evidence that could upset people who preferred to forget the war or preserving testimony that might help others understand how ordinary people could be transformed into instruments of systematic cruelty. Müller chose preservation, donating the confession to the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, where it was authenticated, analyzed, and eventually made available to researchers studying the psychology of perpetrators during the Holocaust. Wilhelm's testimony provided crucial insight into the mentality of guards who had participated in atrocities not from ideological conviction but from the simple pleasure of exercising absolute power over helpless victims. Dr. Sarah Hoffman, a historian specializing in perpetrator psychology, spent 2 years analyzing Wilhelm's confession and attempting to verify the details of his service record. Military archives confirmed his assignment to the 4th SS Police Division, his participation in anti-partisan operations in Poland, his transfer to garrison duty in Germany during the final months of the war. Wilhelm's letter reveals the banality of evil in its most naked form. Dr. Hoffman wrote in her analysis, "It shows us how the capacity for sadism exists in ordinary people, waiting for circumstances that will permit its expression." Wilhelm was not a psychopath or ideological fanatic. He was a normal young man who discovered that causing suffering could be pleasurable, and that war provided opportunities to explore that pleasure without legal or social consequences. The confession was published in the Journal of Holocaust and Genocide Studies in 1992, causing immediate controversy among readers who struggled to categorize Wilhelm's crimes. Some condemned him as a war criminal whose confession was meaningless without accountability. Others saw him as a victim of systems that had corrupted his fundamental humanity. Most recognized their own capacity for similar choices under similar circumstances. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. Benjamin Rosenberg, Jakob's grandson, a professor of literature at Hebrew University who had spent 40 years researching his grandfather's fate. Benjamin had known only that Jakob had died during deportation, with no details about the circumstances or the people responsible for his death. Reading Wilhelm's confession was the most painful and important moment of my academic career. Benjamin wrote in his response to the publication. For the first time, I knew exactly how my grandfather died, who killed him, why he was murdered. Wilhelm's confession gave my grandfather a voice, preserved his memory, ensured that his death would be remembered as the murder it was rather than the natural death that official records claimed. Wilhelm's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature, the appeal of power, and the circumstances that can transform ordinary people into enthusiastic participants in systematic cruelty. How many people possess the capacity for sadism that Wilhelm discovered in himself? How many would make similar choices if given similar opportunities to exercise power without consequences? The village of Rostock, where Wilhelm was born, has erected a memorial to all victims of Nazi persecution, including Jakob Rosenberg, whose name appears among thousands of others who died during the Holocaust. The memorial makes no mention of Wilhelm, but local historians have preserved his story as part of the broader narrative about how communities produced both victims and perpetrators, often from the same families, sometimes from the same moral education. The institute that houses Wilhelm's confession receives visits from school groups, researchers, and individuals struggling to understand how the Holocaust was possible. Wilhelm's testimony is considered among the most valuable documents in their collection because it reveals the psychology of perpetrators without the ideological justifications that most war criminals provided in their post-war testimonies. The mirror that Wilhelm feared to face for 40 years was found in his apartment, covered with a cloth that had not been removed for decades. The mirror now hangs in the Institute's exhibition about perpetrator psychology, accompanied by Wilhelm's confession and the simple question, what would you see if you looked into this mirror after committing similar acts? Visitors often avoid looking at their own reflections while reading Wilhelm's words. Understanding instinctively that mirrors can reveal truths we prefer not to acknowledge about our own capacity for cruelty when circumstances provide permission and power provides opportunity. Subscribe so these forbidden stories never vanish again. Wilhelm's confession has been translated into 12 languages, studied by psychologists and historians, referenced in dozens of books about the psychology of evil and the human capacity for moral transformation. But its most important audience remains the individuals who read his words and wonder whether they would have made different choices under similar pressure to prove their strength through others' suffering. The questions Wilhelm's story raises have no comfortable answers. What circumstances could transform us into people we would not recognize? How much power would we need before we began to enjoy causing pain? When does the demonstration of strength become the practice of sadism? And when does the practice of sadism become the foundation of identity? Wilhelm believed that he had discovered something fundamental about his own nature during his service in Poland, that beneath the facade of civilization, beneath the moral education provided by loving parents, beneath the religious instruction about mercy and forgiveness, there existed a capacity for cruelty that had been waiting for permission to express itself. His confession preserves that discovery for anyone willing to confront the possibility that similar capacities might exist in themselves, that the difference between protector and predator might depend more on circumstances than character, that the faces we see in mirrors might change depending on the power we are given over others who cannot resist our will. The prayer book that contained Wilhelm's confession has been preserved alongside his testimony, its hollowed-out pages serving as a reminder that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud, too shameful to acknowledge publicly, too devastating to preserve except in secret places where they can wait for people brave enough to confront what they reveal about human nature. In the silence after Wilhelm's final words, we can still hear the echo of laughter that accompanied an old man's death, still feel the weight of power that transformed a fisherman's son into someone who found entertainment in suffering. We can still see the stranger in the mirror who wore Wilhelm's face while discovering that causing pain could be more satisfying than preventing it, more rewarding than the simple human connections that had once made life meaningful. Wilhelm's story ends not with redemption but with recognition that the capacity for such cruelty exists in ordinary people, that circumstances can activate potentials we prefer to believe we do not possess, that mirrors can reflect truths about ourselves that make continued living unbearable. File number 1987, KR47 remains open at the Institute for Contemporary History, a permanent reminder that some confessions demand eternal witness, some laughter echoes across generations, some mirrors reflect images that haunt their viewers long after the original actions have ended. Now I can't look in the glass. The mirror shows me who I really am.